today's program, the topic is Escrow 101. Our speaker is Kali from Elite Escrow. Kali, do you want to introduce yourself more by yourself?
Yes, good morning, everyone. My name is Carly, and I'm from Elite Escrow Services. Thank you for having me on your training session today.
Great. Yeah, so I will let you to take the lead then.
Okay, wonderful. Let's see here.
So Katie, can you see the screen of Kali?
Yes.
Great, yeah.
Okay, all right, here we go. Well, welcome everyone to this training this morning. Today's topic is going to be Escrow 101. So let's get started with basically what is escrow. So I've attached here the official definition of an escrow. However, simply put, escrow is basically the center of an escrow transaction. We're kind of like the middleman. We handle all the drawing of the documents, the execution of the documents, the recordation of the documents, and all the funds that transfer in and out of the escrow transaction. So basically, we just keep the escrow moving along and moving forward with communicating with all the parties involved in the transaction.
Okay.
So what are the most important things an escrow does? Most importantly, we remain neutral in the transaction. Also, and as an escrow holder, we don't do anything without an instruction signed by all parties involved in the transaction. So if you can see on the left here, we kind of act as the hub of communication for everyone involved. Everyone down to the buyer, the seller, the agents, the buyer's lender, if any, transaction coordinators, if you're using one, all the way down to the buyer's insurance company and the HOA, the homeowners association, if there is one involved. And last but not least, we handle all the funds in the transaction coming in or out from the buyer and seller, buyer's lender. Any funds that pass through the escrow, they pass through us.
Okay.
So let's talk about who can perform escrow services in California. In the past, attorneys and banks have done escrows themselves as well, but typically in today's market, the escrow is done by 3 different entities. You have an escrow that's affiliated with the title company, and they're licensed by the Department of Insurance. You have real estate brokers or loan brokers who sometimes have an in-house escrow, and they're licensed under the Department of Real Estate. And then you have companies like ourselves at Elite Escrow, where we're actually a neutral third party, no affiliation to any other company, and we're licensed by the Department of Business Oversight. So next, let's talk about the key players of an escrow. A typical escrow involves 7 preliminary players, starting with the seller, and then you have the buyer, who those 2 parties are actually the principals of our transaction, and that's who we take the majority of our instructions from. They must execute everything in the transaction in order for us to move forward. In some cases, the buyer's working with a lender, so we'll work closely with them in meeting all the conditions of the buyer's loan, and helping to facilitate getting the buyers approved for their loan to close the transaction. Next, obviously, you have realtors like yourself who work closely with the buyers and sellers, handle all the disclosures, the execution of the contract. We work closely with them to make sure all their conditions for their files are met. In some cases, the realtor will work with a transaction coordinator, and what this person usually does is help the agent with the paperwork on the file, just keeping your file organized, making sure all your I's are dotted, your T's are crossed, so that all your compliance matters with your company are met. Next, we have the title company. This is a really important party in the transaction. We actually don't do an escrow unless there's a title company involved. The title company will pull the chain of title on the property. This is going to tell you the legal description. It's going to tell you who owns the property. It's going to tell you if there's any liens, judgments, and possibly just whatever current lender the seller has on the property. And then last but not least, you have the escrow officer who's going to read this title report, examine it, and decide what items need to be addressed to pass on clear title to the new buyer.
Okay.
So let's just talk about the escrow process. I have a couple things here that basically lays out a simple life of an escrow, a traditional escrow. So the realtor will submit the purchase agreement to the escrow company once it's fully executed, signed and initialed by all parties. Typically within 3 days, the buyer will submit their initial good faith deposit into escrow. At that point, the escrow officer will prepare the escrow instructions, send out the escrow packages to the buyer and seller for execution. Also, the title report will be ordered at this time, and that's when we review it and make sure that the title is clear and we start working on those items. If there's a lender involved, we start working with the lender very soon in the process to make sure that we're up to date on all the fees that we're disclosing, because they're working with timeframes on their end so that they can get their loan qualified in this amount of time when we're ready to close. Once we're ready to close the transaction, anywhere from 30 to 45 to 60 days are common timeframes of an escrow transaction. The escrow officer will perform a final audit on the file and send out to all the parties any items that still may be outstanding. So it's really important during this time frame that you make sure that your buyers and sellers are readily available. We find many times they're suddenly on vacation and we can't get a hold of them. So just when you're getting in the last couple of days before closing, make sure that your buyers or sellers know to be on alert on their cell phones, their emails, so that if we need to send them a DocuSign at the last minute to get the buyer's loan funded and close escrow, that we can do that and there's no delay in the closing. Last but not least, when we're ready to close, all the conditions have been met, we will request the closing funds from the buyer or the buyer's lender. Once those funds are in and all conditions have been met, we will request the recording of the deed with the county recorder, which we would call recording, the recording process. So what happens is the deed actually goes down to the county, it places a stamp on it, and it transfers the property from the seller to the buyer, and the buyer becomes the legal owner. We call this recording confirmation. Once we've received this recording confirmation from the title company, we go ahead and balance out our file, disperse any funds left over to the seller, and pay any invoices that have been submitted to escrow, commissions, etc. And then once that's done, we'll go ahead and issue the final closing statements to all the parties involved in the transaction. So I just wanted to point out this page to you. It's item number 20 in the purchase agreement, and it has to do with our role in the transaction. Currently, the residential purchase agreement and joint escrow instructions you'll see there, the contract actually acts as your escrow instructions today. So once you have a fully executed contract from the buyer and seller, you technically do have your escrow instructions. If you see here under item number 20A, it talks about all the items in the contract that pertain to us as the escrow holder. Some of those items are, don't go into as much detail as we would like. So what we do is we create what's called our supplemental instructions, and we go into a little more detail on the items that do pertain to us. And then we also attach our general provisions, which it also instructs us to do here in item 20A. So I just wanted to make you familiar with that item of the contract. So next I put together a little escrow checklist for you. So in order for you to have a smooth escrow, these are pretty much the basics that'll help you kind of move along and make sure that your escrow moves smoothly. So first off, you're going to have your executed purchase agreement, any counters or addendums for the transaction. Now I put this here because oftentimes we receive a contract that's missing initials, missing signatures, or is not signed by the proper parties of the transaction. Sometimes when agents go to their listing appointment and they're sitting with their seller, that might not even be the person who is on the title of the property. So it's really important that the person that you're meeting with has signing authority to sign on behalf of the entity or the person that is signing the contract. This will alleviate us having to go back and have items re-signed, through the escrow transaction. Also, it's important that you provide us with the commission amounts, of course. We want to make sure that you get whatever is due to you. Often we're provided with a listing agreement. This usually breaks down the commission of both agents involved. Typically, if there's a transaction coordinator fee being paid out in the transaction, this will be listed in the listing agreement as well. Now, that is really important because if the buyer is paying a transaction coordinator fee and it's not coming out of the agent's commission, this goes back to our fee disclosure. So all fees must be disclosed to the lender up front. Sometimes changes in those fees can cause a delay in the closing. So basically, if you give us a listing agreement, also the MLS printout is very handy because that will tell us the commission sometimes as well, and also lists the homeowners association information. And again, we need to disclose the HOA dues on the buyer's side for fee disclosure as well. If you are going to be working with a transaction coordinator, be sure to include that contact information when you open the escrow. This way, right off the bat, we can be sure to include them in all of our correspondence on the transaction, and again, disclose their transaction coordinator fee if there's one being paid directly to them. Also, be sure to let us know who your title representative is, who you choose to work with, what title company you prefer, so that we can open the title report with that company and make sure that the proper title rep gets credit for that transaction. Also, this seems like something very simple, but many people forget to do this. Please provide us with your client's contact information. Whether you're representing the seller or the buyer, the purchase agreement doesn't have this information on there. So we need their, the names they like to go by. If they have a doctor label in front of their name, their phone numbers, their email addresses, their current address. Sometimes the seller is not living at the property. Sometimes the buyer is not living, locally. So we need to know these things to help facilitate moving forward with the transaction. Also, when we send out documents via DocuSign, it's important that we do have an email address for both of the signers. So the sooner we gather that information, the better towards the end. We don't have to have a delay in the closing, just tracking these items down. Also, it's important if the buyer is obtaining a loan for the transaction, please provide us with the lender contact immediately. This will ensure that we can reach out to them and disclose to them all of our fees that we know of thus far involved in the transaction. Again, they're working on timeframes on their end that if we don't disclose properly initially, it will cause a delay in the closing. Going back one to the seller's contact information, let's say that the seller acquired the property single, but now that you're meeting with them and they're selling their home, they're married. So this is important information that we confirm the marital status, and we have to address if there'll be any spousal deeds signed, making sure that both parties have signed the purchase agreement as well. And then getting down to the last item here, the buyer's vesting. It's really important if you're representing the buyer that you check with your buyers and see how they want to take title. Do they want to take title as husband and wife? Do they want to take title in their trust? Do they want to take title as an entity, like a corporation or an LLC? This is really important. One, it could affect the type of title policy that they obtain. Two, we need to confirm the signing authority and make sure that we get the proper documentation over to the title company for approval that they have the right to sign on behalf of this entity. And three, if there is a lender involved in the transaction, we need to make sure that they're willing to lend to the buyers in their trust or entity as well.
Okay.
So why it's important to choose an independent escrow company like Elite? Basically, we are licensed by the Department of Business Oversight. And what this means is we are not affiliated with any title company, mortgage broker, or real estate broker. And we are required to follow very, very strict regulations on wires, safety. We have annual audits in place that are required by the Department of Business Oversight to keep us on track and compliant with their regulations. We are subject to the most stringent consumer protections in the industry. And also working with an independent company, we stay in our lane, this is what we do, and this is what we're experts at, so we take pride in our excellent service that we provide as well.
That's great.
So I think we're coming to the end of our presentation here, and I just wanted to provide you with my contact information. If you have any questions on the presentation, please feel free to reach out to me. Also, we do have an ebook It's called Surviving Escrow. That's a great tool. And we also have an animation video, what to expect when you're opening escrow. This is an amazing tool for your buyers or sellers, and it just kind of gives a little layout of the escrow transaction in a little more detail than what I went into today. So I really want to thank you for your time today. And if you have any questions, I don't know, James, if you wanted to open it up for Katie to ask questions now, or if we should.
I have a couple of questions. Thank you for this great information. Yeah, you can email me this ebook and a video. That'll be great. Okay. So a couple of things here. First, for escrow, after we close the escrow, how many years you guys will keep in the file on record? So something we need.
I believe it is 5. I believe it is 5, James.
So 5 years. Okay.
It might be 3, but I think it's 5.
Okay.
And we're pretty much paperless now, so you know, we scan everything in, and all of our files are paperless now. So usually that's not an issue.
Okay.